do the right thing. As Michelle said, my title for this talk is Wood and Woodlands in the Icelandic Literary, Documentary and Archaeological Sources, which you'll appreciate is the most enormous topic. And firstly, I hope I'm not running through things too fast. Secondly, I hope it's not too rambling, but at least it should kind of leave plenty of scope for questions at the end. Yes, without further ado, Iceland was colonised, as you probably all know, by Norse settlers in the late 9th century AD. One of the oldest historical sources we have relating to the settlement of Iceland is the Íslendingabók, which kind of briefly describes key events in early Icelandic history, and is thought to be written in the early 12th century AD, sort of at least 250 years after the first settlers arrived. So, as well as giving a date for the settlement of AD 874, the Íslendingabók also describes the landscape as the first settlers encountered it, including this famous quote that I've included on this slide, saying that in those days Iceland was covered with woodland from the mountains to the seashores. Anyone who's been to Iceland or travelled in Iceland will know that this statement is in stark contrast with the modern Icelandic landscape, as you can see a kind of snapshot of in this picture below. Much of the landscape is not just devoid of trees, but almost entirely devegetated, with the effects of large-scale soil erosion quite widely visible. So it's obvious, for a start, that some big changes have occurred in the past 1,000 or so years. So we have to take the idea that Iceland was covered with woodland from the mountains to the shores with some scepticism. Various palaeoenvironmental studies, including palaeontological work and computer modelling simulations, have suggested that at the time of landnám, so settlement, the woodland cover of Iceland was around 25 to 40%, and in modern times it's around 1%. And so what the map on this slide does is it shows the estimated maximum limit of woodland cover based on altitude alone, with average summer temperatures of 7.6 degrees C, which is this outer black dotted line, and 9 degrees C, which is this inner grey line. Overlaid on this, the red dots indicate a location where forest, woodland or woody scrubland is mentioned in the sagas. The Íslendinga saga, I should say. You can see that some areas have no references to woodland, along here, down here. And this is where there are areas of wetland or lava fields or glacial outwash plains, which would never have been suitable for woodland growth. However, you can also see how kind of widely spread these red dots are, and most of them are in locations which are not home to woodland in the present day. So when the first settlers arrived, they cleared woodland areas to make way for buildings and hay fields. They used timber for the woodlands for carpentry, construction, fuel, charcoal production, and they also introduced animals such as sheep, which grazed in the woodlands. These activities certainly had impacts on the landscape, but the traditional view that Icelandic woodlands declined sharply soon after colonisation is being challenged by palaeoenvironmental studies, which are beginning to suggest that decline was much slower in some areas of the country than in others, and that landscape change was very regionally variable. So the palaeoenvironmental evidence gives us a picture of what landscape and vegetation of Iceland was like at the time of settlement, and how it changed after the settlers arrived. However, what pollen data can't do is tell us how the early Icelanders used the landscape and how they thought about it. This is where historical and archaeological evidence comes in. So I'm going to start by looking at the literary sources. There's a huge body of medieval literature from Iceland, but today I'm going to focus on the sagas of the Icelanders, which relate to the settlement period. And while the historicity of the individuals and events narrated in the sagas is completely up for debate, what they can tell us is about how early Icelanders used and perceived their landscape at the time that the sagas were written. To illustrate this, I'm going to give examples relating to three categories of wood resources: native Icelandic woodlands, imported timber, and driftwood. So let's start with the woodland. In the sagas, when woodland is mentioned, it's often in connection with the description of an individual's land claim. So the lands colonised by the first settlers are often described as including rich or dense woodland, in passages which are kind of enumerating the good quality of the land claim and the resources which are available there. A trend we'll see repeated throughout this examination of the sagas is how often they're written in a way which kind of either subtly or overtly highlights the wealth or high status of an individual or of a family. I believe that this inclusion of woodland, which is essential to provide charcoal for metalworking, in the description of the land claim, is one of these subtle ways in which high status is signalled in the narrative. Interestingly though, just like in the Íslendingabók, the woodlands described in the sagas are often very clearly in the past tense. They're described as something that used to be there, but is no longer present. And this all combines to give the impression of woodland as having been something important, which was observed to be being lost. Sometimes the clearance of woodland is explicitly mentioned. For example, both Hrafnkelssaga Freysgårda and Laxdælasaga describe the clearance of woodland areas for house construction. In other cases, the use of woodland area provides background for the narrative, so events occur while individuals are chopping wood or making charcoal, and these activities are kind of presented as a fairly unremarkable aspect of daily life in early Iceland. In some cases, however, the use and ownership of woodland areas is the basis for conflict. For example, in Eyrbyggjasaga, Snorri Goði takes over the ownership of the woodland at Krákunes, which is described as the best possession in the area, from another character named Þórólfur, as part of a kind of deal regarding an existing feud. However, after a while, Þórólfur decides that Snorri is cutting too much wood at Krákunes, and he tries to claim back the land. And Snorri disagrees and continues to use the woodland, and eventually the land dispute spirals into another feud, which leaves a load of characters dead, because this is the sagas. All of this together gives the impression that, at least by those recounting the sagas, woodland was a very important possession. Having woodland on your land made you a wealthy individual. It was something that was worth boasting about and worth fighting for. Despite this, one thing to remember is that the trees found in many Icelandic woodlands tend to be relatively small, with a kind of naturally twisted growth form made worse by the kind of harsh climate of the island. Taller, straighter trees would certainly have existed, but they would have been relatively rare, and the short growing season, along with the impacts of grazing animals, meant that the trees would take a long time to recover after being chopped down or cleared. So it's likely that a lot of the straight timbers required for certain elements in carpentry and construction might have been difficult to obtain from the native woodlands. One way that the sagas, and historical sources as well, suggest that early Icelanders solved this problem is through the import of timber from Scandinavia. Travelling to Norway to fetch timber is a very common motif throughout the sagas, and such voyages are mentioned in Hávarðarsaga Ísfirðings and Víglundssaga, and in Laxdælasaga there are several instances of characters travelling to Norway to fetch timber. The timber that's brought from Norway is used for both houses and for churches, but an interesting thing about these timber collecting voyages is that they almost always involve direct contact between the saga character and the Norwegian king or some other powerful and wealthy individual. And kind of keep this in mind, it's another piece of evidence about how access to resources kind of reinforces the prestige of the individuals described. There's also some tantalising hints in both Eiríkssaga Rauða and Grænlendingasaga about the potential import of timber to Greenland from Vinland in North America, but there's not a lot of archaeological and historical evidence to back that up, although I'm hoping we can hear more about that from Ellie in the next talk. So, while imported timber is commonly mentioned in the sagas, the inhabitants of medieval Iceland also had access to another source of timber in the form of driftwood, which arrives in large quantities along the coast of Iceland, especially in the northwest. One of the best known references is in Grettissaga, where Grettir is using driftwood as fuel while hiding out on the island of Drangey, and his enemies use this against him by sending a cursed log of driftwood to the island. Grettir injures himself while chopping the log, and, spoiler alert, this wound leads to his death. But while this is an interesting tale, it doesn't really tell us much about the wood itself, other than that it can be used as firewood. And actual descriptions of the use of driftwood are very few. In Eilsaga, the description of Skallagrim's land claim describes how he was a great shipwright and there was no shortage of driftwood west from Mýrar. And the linking of these two phrases clearly gives the impression that Skallagrim intended to use the driftwood for boat construction or repair, but unfortunately this is all we ever hear about it. In Laxdæla saga, in the same passage I mentioned earlier about clearing the woodland, it said that Olafur built a house in the clearing and that he used wood from the forest for construction, although he also used some driftwood. The kind of casual way this is phrased would seem to indicate that the unusual and important aspect of this phrase is that the woodland was good enough to provide house timber, rather than that driftwood was used for construction. Comparing these references to the frequent mentions of people travelling abroad to collect cargoes of timber, we might assume that imported timber was more common. However, given the emphasis on implying wealth and status that we can see in the sagas, we might also imagine that the use of driftwood was simply too common to mention, while telling how the King of Norway himself gave someone the wood for a house or church is far more exciting. So comparing the saga accounts with archaeological wood assemblages is one way in which we can start to address this inconsistency. Apologise for the bright colour if it's blinding you at this early hour in the morning. But because of the small number of trees found in Iceland and on other North Atlantic islands, it's possible to very easily identify wood types which are not native to the island. Furthermore, studies carried out on modern driftwood assemblages also allow us to identify which species are most likely to arrive as driftwood. So this graph here compares archaeological wood assemblages from several Viking Age and medieval sites in Iceland with others from Scandinavia, the British Isles and the Faroe Islands. And there's a very obvious pattern here, in that the columns on the right, over that side, from the Faroe Islands and from Iceland have much more yellow and orange, whereas I'm going to go into more detail of that, don't worry, but they have much more yellow and orange, while the ones on the left from Britain and Scandinavia have much more blue, green and red. The blue represents oak, which we know to have been preferred for construction and carpentry in Europe since prehistory. But it's not native to Iceland, and we do find significant amounts of oak at Icelandic sites, as you can see in the blue, particularly in Stóraborg and Alþingisreitur there. And it's probably been imported as ready-made artefacts in many cases, such as at Stóraborg, which is this one here, a site in the south of Iceland, where the assemblage that they've looked at in this, the assemblage that this column represents comprises a lot of coopered vessels, so barrels and casks and that kind of thing, which are very commonly made from oak. Now, more oak is found in the British and Scandinavian assemblages simply because it's native to these areas, unlike Iceland. But a particularly interesting comparison can be made by looking at the green section of the columns, which represents deciduous trees other than oak, apart from the native Icelandic species, which are in purple. While these taxa are very common in British and Scandinavian sites, in the North Atlantic sites they're very, very rare, and seem to be replaced by pine and spruce or larch, which are represented by the orange and yellow sections. So while pine and spruce grow in Scandinavia and could conceivably be imported to Iceland, larch, sorry, I've lost my place. That could conceivably be imported to Iceland. Their kind of dominance here, along with larch in Icelandic and Faroese wood assemblages, kind of strongly suggests that driftwood was commonly used for construction, and also for carpentry and for artefact production, kind of replacing a whole variety of species which were much more readily available in Europe. This again suggests that while the mentions of wood in the sagas tend towards emphasising their access to imported timber, most people in Iceland maybe were more likely to have used driftwood, which would have been collected or traded from the Icelandic beaches. So, in terms of the archaeological evidence, it seems like softwoods, such as pine, spruce and larch, dominate the Icelandic and Faroese wood and artefact assemblages, creating this kind of North Atlantic signature of wood use, which is very distinct from patterns of usage in Scandinavia and in the British Isles. At first glance, oak appears to be the only significant imported timber, however this may not be the case. While larch is not native to Scandinavia and almost certainly arrived as driftwood in Iceland, as it does in the present day, Other taxa, such as spruce and Scots pine, could easily also have been imported. We know that pine in particular was important for construction and carpentry in northern parts of Scandinavia, and that timber imported to Iceland could well have come from this region. However, we have very few comparative assemblages of wooden artefacts from this area. So it's possible that the pattern we see in the North Atlantic assemblages is more similar to wood use in those areas, but we just don't have the data to prove it. There are also some difficulties involved in the identification of wood as driftwood. So larch, which I've said is almost certainly driftwood in Iceland, is anatomically very, very similar to spruce, which could easily have been imported. And in archaeological material, it can be impossible to distinguish between the two due to preservation issues. Furthermore, there's the white pine group, which includes species found in Central Europe, Siberia, and North America, which are pretty much impossible to distinguish from one another by their microscopic anatomy. We add to this that the modern driftwood assemblages that we're comparing this to are firstly heavily influenced by logging enterprises, and also may have been affected by changes in forest composition and changes in oceanic circulation, and it becomes kind of difficult to assess the scale of woodland use from the archaeological material alone. So to get an image of how wood was used which isn't, like the sagas, kind of influenced by designs to indicate social status, we can look at the rich body of documentary sources which also exist for Iceland from the medieval period onwards. I'm going to give examples from 3 sets of data: the medieval Loka Grágás, the range of documents collected in Diplomatarium Icelandicum, and the early 18th century land registers. So these sources give us an indication of how resource use was governed, how ownership of woodland areas and driftwood beaches changed over time, and how access to such resources kind of varied between farms and between regions. So, Grágás medieval law code is known from 13th century manuscripts, but the laws that are codified there are likely to have been in use for a much longer period of time. Ownership and usage of woodland areas are prescribed in great detail in Grágás. One of the key statements we have regarding woodland is that the usage of a woodland area should not change. For example, an area which has been exploited for domestic firewood should not then also be used for charcoal making or grazing if there's no history of this. The laws also list penalties for the misuse of woodland, up to punishments as severe as outlawry in some cases. These penalties applied to the misuse or damage of woodland belonging to another, but cases could also be brought by a landowner's neighbours if they thought that their woodland was being overexploited. So it's getting this image that, contrary to this view that early Icelanders destroyed the woodlands with no thought for their conservation, it seems that some efforts to preserve woodland areas were actually enshrined in law. The penalties for misuse of woodland kind of reflect its importance as a resource, and the same can be said of the punishments described for misuse or theft of driftwood. The Grágás laws describe the ownership of driftwood in very great detail. For example, it's stated that ownership of driftwood on a shore extended beyond the beach to the distance out to sea where a split codfish, 1 L wide, it's about the length of my forearm, could be seen on the side of a boat when standing at the low tide mark. So it's very specific. But those who owned their driftwood beaches also had their own specific ownership marks, which they could carve into logs that arrived on their land. So then if they were washed back out to sea and landed on someone else's beach, it would be clear who got there first. So, the laws recorded in Grágás state that woodlands and driftwood beaches can be transferred as well by gifting, sale or payment, and we certainly see these processes at work when we examine the papers collected in Diplomatarium Icelandicum, which includes historical Icelandic letters and documents dating from up to the end of the 16th century. Most of them are from later than AD 1250, but there are rare 12th century examples as well. The majority of these documents kind of relate to church farms and ecclesiastical establishments, and they do give a clear picture of how these institutions kind of consolidated their power and status by acquiring valuable resources such as woodlands and driftwood beaches, which were often in very remote areas far from the farms themselves. And we see this trend continuing in Jarðabók Árna Magnússonar or Páls Védalins, which is a land register compiled in the early 18th century. The work originally covered the whole of Iceland, but unfortunately the volumes relating to counties in the east were lost in the fire in Copenhagen in 1728. But still, the register records the ownership and value of all the properties in all the other counties of Iceland, but it also gives information about access to woodland and driftwood beaches and the use of fuel, and it gives information about smaller farms, which is rarely mentioned in the documents in Diplomatarium Icelandicum. So by the time the land register is being compiled, it seems that driftwood beaches are almost all owned by high-status farms, and high-status farms, ecclesiastical institutions, and or the Danish crown. In some areas, it's noted that tenant farmers on farms with driftwood beaches were allowed to use some of the wood to make household items or even items to sell, but usually the large timber would be collected by the landowner. And in this, we continue to see that driftwood was very rarely used as fuel, except in areas where nothing else was available. It'll be done by then. Except in areas where nothing else was available. Across the country, there's actually a trend visible of wealthier farms having access to more efficient fuel sources, such as wood and peat, while smaller farms have to resort to turf, animal dung, or even seaweed and fish bones. So it's pretty grim in some places. But as I mentioned earlier, while talking about the sagas, there's also still the impression in the land registers that woodland is in significant decline. And in many cases, it's noted that the woodland was cut for fuel or even cut for house timber in living memory, but it's now declined so much as to be barely of use. So these trends of changing ownership and use of woodlands and driftwood are beginning to be borne out in studies of archaeological charcoal, both from domestic contexts and from charcoal making pits, but these studies are quite few and far between. And so far, charcoal and palaeoenvironmental evidence studies, though, they seem to uphold the idea that woodlands in particular became increasingly owned by high-status farms over time, in some areas even indicating that tenant farms in wooded areas were cleared by the landowner in order to preserve the woodland. But more studies need to be carried out to determine if this trend can be seen across the island. However, hopefully you've been able to see that from the documentary and literary sources that the scarce wood resources of Iceland were highly valued and the woodlands were perceived to be declining. And what we need to do when we sort of study the archaeology of this is to take into account these perceptions and the action that might have been taken on them when discussing human impacts on the landscape. So that's been a bit of a quick run through. Thank you all very much for listening, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Dawn, for a very interesting paper. Do we have any questions? Yes?
It's mainly a comment. I just want to say thank you for such an interesting and excellent presentation on a really intriguing topic. And I think, you've gone into this thorny question in a lot of detail, and I can see you're working with some good people. And just to add that research that I've been involved in, it also suggests that people didn't just come there and cut down the trees and didn't care. There was actually quite a lot of emphasis on trying to conserve the woodland and actually, husband it in the best possible way. And that possibly a lot of the loss of woodland came a bit later than settlement times, in the 15th century. Anyway, thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a trend we've definitely been noticing in my historical research and in kind of the archaeological material and in documentary sources. I think it's great there are kind of so many people realising this now and not just taking this traditional, like, Vikings destroyed it kind of view.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Where I live in Shetland, we don't have many trees either, but we have a lot of place names like Woodwick and things where people went to collect driftwood. Yeah. So are you also looking at sort of place name evidence for that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of place names in Iceland that are connected to driftwood. So Keflavik, the international airport, is a driftwood name. Trekillisvik is Driftwood name. Reykjavik, which literally just means drift bay. That's different from Reykjavik, but yeah, there are loads of them around. And I'm actually going to be working in Trekillisvik, which is a bit of an odd one. I'm not entirely sure how to directly translate it, but it's definitely connected to there being trees coming in. And actually I'm going to be doing some field work there in the summer, where there's a smaller bay, which is part of Trekillisvik, which is called Kolgrafavik, which literally means charcoal pit bay. So I'm going to check out and see, hopefully that they were using driftwood to make charcoal in these pits, although charcoal pits can look very similar to robbed pagan graves, so we never quite know what we're going to find until we turn up. But yeah, there's lots of place name evidence as well, and I'm trying to sort of incorporate that in.
Thanks.
Yes, well, just another little comment. You know, there's a conference on driftwood in Iceland next week.
I'm going to be there.
Are you going to be there?
Yeah.
I was going to be there, but now I'm going to be somewhere else.
Well, that's a shame.
I'm so glad you'll be there. That's great.
There's a question now?
It was just a quick question from Ignace. Is it possible that there's also more import of timber that isn't high status that therefore doesn't get mentioned in the sagas?
Absolutely.
Are they only writing about the big events, as it were, and there's ordinary people bringing it in?
I mean, they are kind of writing about it, but I think my hypothesis is that there's so much driftwood available that it was much more readily accessible, and therefore, but it's not. You can't control it as much as you can control imported timber. You know that you're getting the best logs, whereas driftwood it's just whatever happens to wash up, and sometimes you'll get something great, and sometimes you'll just get a load of rubbish. And I think that's where I think the status aspect of it comes in. But yeah, there's not a lot of detail, and the problem is we don't have these sort of documents from the early period. At least we don't have kind of ships manifests or anything like that would tell us what was being brought in. So yeah, absolutely that could be possible, but I'm not sure how much we'll be able to see it through the archaeology. So.
Yes?
But driftwood wouldn't bring in the sort of timber that you could build your stofa houses on, would it? It would.
It would do. I mean, if you've got sort of trees being washed out by these storm events coming down, sort of the most of the driftwood in Iceland derives from central Siberia, and so you've got entire trees being washed out by storm events. And a lot of the modern stuff, yeah, you go to a driftwood beach today, most of what you'll see is from logging. But I mean, there are historical accounts from sort of the 17th century or 18th century probably, which is sort of before really industrialised logging even started, that still mention there being huge trunks washed up. And I think that it would have been big enough. Like there would have been trees that were large enough. And probably you had to take whatever was there. You know, you may not get the absolute perfect part for your roof, you know, but I think they probably had to mix and match a little bit more than they would have liked to at some times.
I don't think they like to mix and match, do they? They wanted the perfect timber, the perfect stover.
Yeah.
And that's why they imported it.
Well, they did. I mean, there's some things, yeah, like the panelling in some places, kind of interior panelling, and there is evidence from. I can't remember which side it was. I think it's probably Utskalar, which is out on the peninsula, and so we've got stuff that we think might have been the interior panelling, and that does all appear to be Scots pine, which the sort of consistency in that would suggest that it might have been brought in from Western Norway. So maybe kind of the decorative and sort of interior aspects would have been more likely to be imported if you could have afforded that. But you also get absolutely beautiful kind of chests and furnishings from the historic period in Iceland, which are carved from driftwood and are very beautiful and very intricate. So.
Yes.
I have a question about where the timber was drifting from, and I was wondering what route it was taking, and whether the currents had changed much in the past 1,000 years. Sorry, that's 3 questions.
Yeah, no, I'm not entirely sure how much change there has been in the past 1,000 years. That's probably a bit beyond my scope. Hopefully someone at the Driftwood meeting next week in Iceland will tell me. But it comes mostly from central Siberia, and it comes along with the transpolar drift stream and down with the East Greenland current. But it does depend. So the transpolar drift stream can move, and also the Beaufort Gaia, which is next to it, the sort of circular ocean current around the pole, can expand and contract. And so I think that there would absolutely be changes depend on whether there was North American driftwood incorporated into the Icelandic assemblages, particularly depending on how big or small the Beaufort gyre was, so whether that was bringing North American timber down close to the transpolar drift stream.
Does that mean that the wood is getting frozen and then unfrozen? Is it getting locked in ice?
Yes, it has to be, yeah. It's, I think the longest that conifer timber can float for without being sort of trapped in ice is about 17 months. And deciduous timber's even less, it's like less than a year.
There is a website where they've modelled changing currents in the North Atlantic, but I'm trying to think whether it goes up as far as Iceland.
Yeah.
It might be worth getting hold of the guys who run that. There's one of them's at Bangor University, but I can give you my card and then you can email me.
Yeah, that'd be
I'm
great.
trying to put you in touch with someone.
That'd be fantastic, so it'd be really great to know that.
All right, we're going to have to stop now, I'm afraid. If you want to continue